Carolina Aguilera. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
As the investigation continues into the recent nightclub fire in Rhode Island, Book TV takes you back 100 years with Nat Brandt, author of Chicago Death Trap, the Iroquois Theatre fire of 1903. This talk from the Chicago Public Library lasts an hour.
Until the recent terrorist attack on the World Trade Center, the Iroquois Theatre fire of 1903 was the deadliest building fire in American history. The victims, mostly women and children, died in the most dreadful of circumstances, asphyxiated in their seats, trampled upon by a panicking audience, or burned beyond recognition. And it was a tragedy that never should have occurred. Let me set the scene, so to speak. The Iroquois Theatre was a new playhouse, all of 5 weeks old. It was a lavishly decorated theater that wrapped itself around a building at the corner of Randolph and Dearborn Streets, where the Oriental Theater is now. It was, its owners boasted, absolutely fireproof. The Iroquois was built to stage huge musical productions, and its premiere offering was a silly musical comedy entitled Mr. Bluebeard. The cast numbered a staggering 280 performers, but that included about 100 extras, mostly youngsters, who were hired locally to portray animal characters. The show's star was a favorite of Chicago audiences, Eddie Foy. He bustled about the stage in the role of Sister Anne, wiggling an unwieldy bustle, often in a direction directly opposite from the way he was moving. Mr. Bluebeard had opened earlier in New York to mixed reviews. The music, critics there said, was loud, the plot ridiculous, and Eddie Foy, one complained, was only intermittently funny. At any rate, he was not so noisy. But the show managed to run 21 weeks in New York. The company then went on the road, playing Pittsburgh, Indianapolis, and Cleveland, biding time until the completion of the Iroquois. In Cleveland, a curtain caught fire because of an electrical overload, but it was quickly extinguished and no one appeared concerned. Despite a series of labor slowdowns that had delayed its completion, the Iroquois Theatre opened in time for the Thanksgiving holiday. To help make up for lost time, performances of Mr. Bluebeard were being held every night and at matinees as well on Wednesdays and Saturdays. Opening night on November 23rd, 1903 was a festive affair. A glittering tuxedo and ball gown audience, most of Chicago's high society, was there. And another incident occurred. But again, nothing was made of it. The theater's ushers, it turned out, had no idea what to do in an emergency. On Wednesday, December 30th, 2 days before Mr. Bluebeard was to close to make way for another musical, the 2 p.m. matinee performance drew a full house. A holiday crowd, so many that there were 200 standees in the orchestra, dress circle, and top balcony, the gallery. In all, the house held nearly 2,000 persons. On stage, peeking out from behind the curtain, Eddie Foy said he had never seen so many women and children in an audience. Even the gallery was full of mothers and their youngsters. It was during the second act that the disaster happened. Started by a short circuit in a floodlight, an almost similar malfunction to what had occurred weeks earlier in Cleveland. The sparks ignited a drop curtain, and soon all the nearly 300 scenic drop curtains were in flames. Foy rushed out onto the stage to try and calm the audience. He called for the asbestos fire curtain to be dropped, but he became snagged while not even halfway down. Then a blast of air shot through the auditorium when a door backstage was opened by fleeing actors and stagehands. It swept toward the ceiling of the top balcony, the gallery, a blast of heated, gaseous fumes. To give you an idea of the horrible scenes that followed, I'd like to read a few excerpts from the book. One of the few survivors who was in the gallery, that is the top balcony, was Jane Strong. Strong was standing with his mother, wife, and niece in the rear of the gallery. They tried to get to the stairway that led down to the dress circle level, but it was too crowded. So they ran down the aisle by the side of the gallery rows and down a short flight of steps to the middle entranceway. But the door there was locked. Strong threw himself against it without success. He then stretched on his toes as far as he could and smashed the glass transom above the door with his fist. Strong hoisted himself up and threw the transom. But once on the other side in a hallway, he found the door secured with a padlock. Just then another man happened to run by. Together the two of them tried to break open the door without success. We worked at the padlock like crazy men, but could make no impression upon it, Strong said, nor could we break the door. The other man boosted Strong up to the transom in the hope that he could pull his family on the other side through it. Strong got the upper portion of his body through and saw his family below. But just at that second, he said, the flames swept through the balcony and smoke poured over the transom. Strong felt himself suffocating, lost his grip, and fell back into the hallway outside. On the other side of the door, his mother, his wife, and his niece lay dead. The convergence of those fleeing the gallery and those exiting the dress circle created an impenetrable tangle. With the theater in darkness, except for the glow cast by the flames in the auditorium, the panic remained unchecked. Covering his mouth with a handkerchief, 70-year-old D.W. Demick made it down from the gallery to the dress circle. He was shocked. People were packed like cordwood, he said. Demick squeezed past many who were writhing on the floor. He caught hold of the arms of one woman who was alive but lying near the bottom of a heap of bodies, trapped by her feet. He pulled her out. Demick then tried to rescue a man who was also caught by the feet. He braced himself against the stairs to get a purchase and started tugging, but he was unable to pull the man free. Those still upright started down the stairwell, but they found their way blocked by locked accordion gates. Soon, as fumes from the burning scenery spread through the theater, the people fell, choking, and died, their bodies creating another pile of corpses at each of the gates. The north side of the Iroquois Theatre faced a narrow alley across the back of the old Tremont House, a landmark hotel that had only recently been taken over by Northwestern University to house its graduate schools. The commotion in the alleyway attracted the attention of some law students who, although it was vacation time, were studying in a library in the rear of the third floor of the building. At the same time, a group of painters working in another room on the third floor also heard the noise from the alleyway. Together, students and painters carried the planks and ladders to the back windows of a lecture room that faced an emergency exit of the gallery, the top balcony of the theater, across the alleyway. They ran out a ladder across the narrow gap, and a man fleeing the inferno inside the theater managed to crawl across it. Another man behind him tried, but the ladder slipped on the ice-covered sill of the lecture room, and he fell to the ground, lifeless. The painters quickly positioned the planks across the gap between the building and the theater and dropped to their knees to anchor the wooden planks. "Come on," they called out. 16-year-old Hortense Lang was the first to cross, dragging her 11-year-old sister Irene. "I was going to jump," she sobbed to the painters, "but I thought of my mother." Behind them came 13-year-old Carrie Anderson, who was guiding two smaller children across the makeshift gangway. In all, a dozen persons edged their way over the planks. The last to cross was Alice Kilroy, a Chicago schoolteacher. Kilroy was no sooner drawn inside the Northwestern lecture room than a pillar of fire bursting from the theater struck the wall of the school building. Across the narrow alleyway, women and children still on the exit landing of the theater died there, the bodies of some dropping to the ground. Firemen rushed into the school and up to the third floor to cross the planks with a hose in order to spray water into the gallery, but the flames made them retreat. With them was Fire Marshal John Campion. "Is there any living person here?" he called out. No one answered. "If anyone here is alive," he shouted again, "groan and make some sound, we'll take you out." Again, no one responded. Campion ordered his men to fall back. As they edged backward over the planks, the fire in the theater billowed once more. A total of 602 persons died in the Iroquois Theatre fire. Every morgue in Chicago was jam-packed with bodies. Inside one of them, a reporter wrote, "In one respect, all the bodies looked alike. The left arm of nearly every victim was held stiff and close to the side, while the right hand was outstretched as if warding off peril. It was such an outstretched hand that attracted the attention of Patrick O'Donnell. Walking through the aisles at one morgue, O'Donnell suddenly stopped to examine a woman's hand that extended from beneath a sheet. On it was the ring he had given his wife for Christmas. O'Donnell knelt and kissed the hand. No one in Chicago celebrated New Year's Eve the next day, Thursday. All dinners, all parties, all dances were canceled. Friday, New Year's Day, was gloomy. Saturday, even grimmer, as victims who had been identified were laid to rest, while relatives still searched among the bodies at the morgues for a recognizable loved one. A silent, wind-driven snowstorm clothed the city in white. The empty streets that had marked New Year's Day the day before were now filled with procession after procession, filing slowly to Chicago's several cemeteries, the horses pulling the hearses and carriages, stepping gingerly through the slush, sometimes slipping. From dawn until into the evening, funeral cortèges moved through the streets in the blinding storm. White hearses bore the bodies of children, black ones the bodies of adults. Long lines of carriages followed the hearses and plain black wagons that had been preempted for the occasion as they wended their way. At noon, church bells throughout the city tolled a solemn dirge. Those hearing it stood hatless in the snowstorm, their heads bowed. And all during the day, while the silent snow fell and the cortèges carried their sad burdens and tears flooded the eyes of the mourners, there were still heartbroken families going solemnly from one morgue to another morgue to another morgue, trying to locate a wife, a husband, a son, a daughter, a grandchild. I said at the beginning of this talk that the Iroquois Theatre fire was a tragedy that never should have occurred, for there were many questions raised by it. Why had the asbestos fire curtain become snagged? Without it, there was no shield between the fire on stage and the audience in the auditorium. Who had left the critical ventilators in the skylights above the stage tied down during construction? There was no way that the flames and fumes could exit except outward toward the audience. Why were there no exit signs whatsoever throughout the theater? Beside which, the exits were concealed behind heavy draperies. No one in the audience knew where to go. Why indeed was a newfangled lock used on the exit doors? Only one usher knew how to open them, and then only because he had tried to do so out of curiosity. Why, in fact, hadn't there been a fire drill and the ushers instructed about what to do in an emergency? Where did those accordion gates come from? They were drawn and padlocked across the stairways leading to the gallery, the top floor, the top balcony, to prevent balcony goers there from sneaking down to better seats during a performance. And this was a sold-out audience. But the gates were not in the plans approved by the city, and because they blocked a means of escape, they would not have been permitted. How is it possible that so many basic safety features were not in place? Why wasn't there any sprinkler system installed in the theater? Why weren't there any hoses for the standpipes backstage? Why, for that matter, wasn't there any water whatsoever for those pipes? The sprinkler system, the hoses, the water for them, all were required by law. How come a battalion chief inspected the theater, noticed the lack of firefighting equipment, but never felt the need to report it to superiors? Who, in fact, considering all the deficiencies in the building's fire safety, who in the city's building department had ever given the okay permitting the theater to open 5 weeks earlier? Who then was responsible for the fire? The theater's architect for not seeing that the exits were clearly marked and accessible? The theater's managers for not holding any fire drills or seeing that the fire hoses were attached and working? Fire department officials for not making certain that all the safety regulations were enforced? The construction company that had not seen fit to check that the ventilators were operable? The city inspector who had turned his eye from all the violations? Who? Who was responsible? Who, in fact, was held responsible? And the answer to those questions are very much a part of my book about the Iroquois Theatre fire. I'd like to get some questions from the audience now. I know that recently you had the fire about 2 weeks ago at the E2 Club, and then, of course, the one a week later in Rhode Island. Pardon me a moment. And I found myself deluged with calls from the local media, radio, television, and newspapers. What were the comparisons? What parallels could be drawn? And my reaction was kind of threefold. First, the panic. How do you deal with people who feel their lives are threatened? How do you handle crowds like that who are, in a sense, going berserk? In terms of the Iroquois Theatre fire, psychologists who study mass behavior point to it as a prime example of panic. Then, of course, how come the ushers didn't know what to do, how to direct people? Same with security guards in the nightclub, for goodness sakes. You have to know what to do if an emergency occurs and how to direct people to get out of the building. And then, of course, the violations. The coincidence is amazing. The Iroquois Theatre had gotten an okay to open, even though, as I pointed out, so many things were missing. It's just astonishing to me, incredible. I can't get over what happened, the confluence of all these things happening at this time. It should never have happened. Anybody got a question? Please feel free. Yes, sir.
You mentioned about the.
I think the gentleman wants to carry the sound. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah. You mentioned.
The question you threw out was, why did the asbestos curtain become snagged? But
okay.
I thought I'd read that the curtain actually, even though it became snagged, actually burned and wasn't actually fireproof. What was the issue on that?
Well, two things. First of all, it became snagged because on the right side of the theater, that is right side from the audience point of view, was a reflector light that when the performance started, the reflector light was brought out so that if its lights that, toward the stage were needed, it was in position. And the man who handled that swinging reflector light walked away from it at the time. And the reflector light was out, the curtain started to come down and caught on it. It got about halfway down and then stopped. And where the guy was, nobody knows. Actually, the fire started on the floodlight, I said. That was on the opposite side of the stage. And the man who operated that floodlight had also, the lighting operator, had also walked away during the performance. And he should have been there. Now, the asbestos fire curtain, yes, it did burn. In fact, at the Chicago Historical Society, they have a fragment of it. And you're not allowed to touch it because it just falls apart. There was a study done afterwards and a lot of criticism made about the kind of curtain it was, that it wasn't really fireproof in the finest sense of the word. But the heat, on the other hand, was so intense from what happened with all those nearly 300 scenic curtains, the drop curtains coming down backstage. It was just an enormous I think it would have melted anything at that point. Yes, sir.
Was there any truth to the fact that some of the exits were in fact hidden by draperies and
Oh, yes, I pointed that out, that they were. Yes, and I have to say something about Benjamin Marshall, who was the architect of the Iroquois Theatre fire. Now, here in Chicago, Benjamin Marshall is kind of, he's not a saint really, but he's certainly one of the premier architects of the city. He did a number of the high-rise apartments on Lakeshore Drive, the Blackstone Hotel, among other places. He was very well known. He not only designed a theater, but he was very fussy. He wanted also to have a say in how it looked inside, the decor, the furnishings. He ordered exit lights, but they weren't ready when the theater opened 5 weeks earlier. And they still weren't ready on the day of the disaster. And he refused to put up hand-lettered signs or anything in their place because it would ruin the look of the place. The draperies were also his idea. Now, the doors, the exit doors on what was called the north side of the building, the main exit that led to fire escapes, they swung outward. There was no doubt about that. But they were held in place. There were two sets of doors, interior, and then you went to an iron door outside. They were held in place by something called a bascule lock. It had never been used before in a theater in Chicago. It was very popular in Europe, was used there. Nobody knew how to handle that kind of lock. So there were exit doors they could have swung open if anybody knew how, okay? It's as I said, one thing after another leading to things. Now, afterwards, Marshall was asked, you know, what happened? Oh, he said, nobody would have been killed if it hadn't been for the panic. The co-owners and co-managers of the theater were asked, what happened? Why did this take place? Oh, panic. Wouldn't have happened if people hadn't panicked. The construction company that had tied down these ventilators over the sky. Now, this is very important. If you have a fireplace, you know you need a flue, and the flames and the gas go up the flue. Well, that's what those ventilators above the stage are for in case of a fire. Oh, the construction company said, no. It was a perfect building, absolutely fireproof. And ironically, the building was fireproof. The building survived the fire. 9 months later, over a great deal of protest, it reopened as a vaudeville house. And that didn't last very long, and it finally became a theater for drama, straight drama, called the Colonial Theater. And that lasted until, about 1924. The theater closed, and the building itself was torn down. The Oriental Theater is in a building that was built on the site there. Yeah, oops, a lady.
Was all of the damage then confined to the interior of the theater, or wasn't there that much actual fire damage? I mean,
there was fire damage in the interior. For example, the people that...
Put it out?
I'm sorry?
Were they able, and then second question, were they able to put it out?
No, but there was no water. The only fire extinguisher backstage were some canisters of what was called kill fire. That was the brand name. And that was, of all things, a bicarbonate of soda mixture, a powder that you threw at a flame. Well, it was totally, it didn't do a thing. There were attempts to do it with the kill fire. But there was no water, there were no hoses, nothing. Parts of the theater did burn. I mean, the curtains backstage, the backstage was a disaster afterwards, as you can imagine, for all those curtains going up. And also with the blast of air, which occurred when the actors and stagehands fled, they went to a stage door exit, which were in a pair of freight doors, you know, that open up to handle scenery, huge freight doors. They opened that up. It was cold outside, 8 degrees, blast of cold air comes in, under the asbestos curtain which it snagged, and right up to the balcony. People died right in their chairs where they were sitting immediately. That's before the panic even happened. Yes, sir.
If you had been judge and jury, who would you have held to blame for the fire?
I'm going to answer that. There was a coroner's jury. Indicted several people, including the mayor of Chicago, Carter Harrison Jr. He was subsequently found that it wasn't really his fault, it turned out. There was a regular grand jury, indicted 5 people, and the most prominent one of the 5 was one of the co-owners of the theater, a fellow by the name of Will Davis. Will Davis was considered the top theatrical producer in Chicago, all right? He was charged with manslaughter. The commissioner of buildings who had given the okay to the theater was charged with malfeasance. Anyway, there were years of litigation, back and forth, delays, motions, changes of venue. It took about 3 years before finally the first of the 5 people who were indicted, okay, Will Davis was brought to trial in Peoria, okay? And the trial started, a jury was selected, jury was sworn in and seated. The prosecuting attorney got up and made an opening statement. The defense attorney, Will Davis's attorney, said, no, I'll wait. A first witness was called to testify, was sworn in, and at that point, the defense attorney put up his hand and said, hold it. He questioned the validity of the city's fire code. He said that state regulations superseded them. Well, as you can imagine, an argument broke out between him and the prosecuting attorney. The judge said they had to file briefs. There were also oral arguments after the briefs were presented. It went on for a week, and the judge said the defense attorney was right. The Chicago Fire Code was invalid. State regulations superseded them. The trial is over. Mr. Davis is free. And not only that, but since the trial had started, Davis could not be re-indicted. It would have been double jeopardy. And as a result of what happened in his case, the charges against the other 4 people who had been indicted were also dropped. Nobody was ever held legally responsible for the fire. There were hundreds, as you can imagine, hundreds of lawsuits filed against, well, for one thing, the city. City was for not enforcing the fire code that was on the books anyway. A judge decided you can't sue the city no more than you can sue the President of the United States if West Point burns down. The theater company, of course, the owners of the theater were sued, but the theater company went bankrupt, so no money was there. The only one who ever paid anything out was the construction company, and that was many years later. A lot of people dropped their lawsuits because the cost of the attorney's fees were too much. It was down to maybe 50 or 60 lawsuits left that the construction company settled out of court for less than $30,000, gave them each $750. That's why it's, I don't know what other words to use, but incredible, astonishing. You know, it's impossible to understand what happened as a result. Yes, sir.
One of the stories often associated with the fire is that a number of the exit doors opened inward instead of outward. That's the fire that resulted in panic bars, and there's been like conflicting stories about that.
No, in fact, and I have diagrams in the book. You'll see diagrams of the layout of the orchestra floor, the dress circle floor, the top balcony, the gallery floor. The doors open outwards. However, not only the problem with that lock or the draperies, that people couldn't even find the exits, but downstairs there were 3 sets of double doors leading from the grand staircase, which was the main, what you walked into, leading into the lobby, and then 3 sets of double doors leading to the street outside, okay? So you had lots of doors, but only 1 set was kept open during the performance because they didn't want people sneaking into the theater. So yes, doors will, but they did open outwards. It's just that, you know, the theater went a little overboard in terms of its own security in that way. Yes, ma'am.
What prompted or inspired you to write the book?
Sorry, I can't
What
hear you.
prompted or inspired you to write the book?
When I look for a project, I very often, and I guess it's part of my background, when I was in newspapers, you could always earn a little extra by doing a feature for the Sunday paper. You know, there's a lot of Sunday paper, and you could earn 25 bucks extra by doing, and I would always look up what happened 50 years ago, what happened 100 years ago. Well, when I started writing books, I started to do that also. My very first book was based on something I spotted in the New York Times Index that occurred at this point, I forget, in 1864. Well, anyway, I was looking for another project a couple of years ago. I looked up the New York Times Index, and you look ahead because it takes time to research and write the book. And I saw 1903, December 30th, 602 people killed. I had never heard of it, to be quite honest. I apologize for that, but I was astounded. And immediately I went to the public library, searched to see if there had been any other books, went on the internet also to see, surely a story like that would have been written about. The only books that ever came out were several months later in 1904. Nothing had been written since, okay? That's what got me into it. Yes, any other, again?
We have one of those books here.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
Oh, there's something very funny about those books. All right, let me check another. They have different titles. One has the name of an author on it. The other has an introduction by a Bishop Fallows, who actually was walking along Randolph Street at the time of the fire and went into the building to try and help people. But aside from the introductory material, the two books are page for page and word for word alike. They're the same book. The copyright is held by the same person. I never found out who it was, but it's a very odd circumstance to have, and two different publishers, to have two books, but it's the same book. I have them both. Yes. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am, again.
This was not that long, relatively speaking, in time to the Chicago fire. Not that far after the Chicago fire.
Some 30-odd years.
About 30 years. And
yeah.
It was always my understanding from history books and everything that the Chicago fire gave rise to one of the strictest fire codes any city ever had when they rebuilt the city.
No, actually it was a fire a couple of years later. There was a, what do they call it, the small fire? Just a couple of years later. Didn't destroy as much of the city, but the insurance companies that were handling the buildings in the city finally pressured the city into coming up with a better fire code.
So
yeah.
My question then is,
Yeah,
there probably was still a fairly stringent fire code in the city, and
Oh yes.
it seems incredible that so much of it could have been ignored
Will Davis.
by everybody.
Yeah. Will Davis was
Okay,
asked
maybe the
after
construction company, but it just seems
Yeah.
to me that they were so fire conscious and always have been in this city that it just
You
seems
would
that
think so. Will Davis was asked afterwards, why wasn't there any sprinkler system as required by law? Now, Will Davis had only recently also put up another theater called the Illinois Theater, and Benjamin Marshall was the architect of that too. And Will Davis's response to that was, and there were some like 30 theaters in Chicago at that time, okay? Will Davis's response was, no theater in Chicago has a sprinkler system. It was quite obvious that the theater owners, as a group, had all sorts of influence with certain aldermen. Corruption was sort of rampant in Chicago at that time. The city had a terrible reputation that way, and I guess that accounts for some of what happened. Now, no corruption was ever proved in the case of the Iroquois Theatre. Nobody said so-and-so was paid money to say okay. Nothing like that was ever proved, but it was always in the background. Obviously, how did it get an approval to open? And the theater owners turned their backs on things. Absolutely. Yeah, I'm sorry.
What was the response of the fire department like to the fire?
It was very good. Actually, within, anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes, the fire department was on the scene. However, the great number of deaths, the suffocation, the asphyxiation when that blast of air went through, all that and the burning all occurred within about 3 minutes. By the time they came, they were acting to try and help the people who were trying to get out. I mean, it was too late. The fire, as I said, the theater survived the fire. So no, there was no question that the fire department hadn't done a good job. They'd been there. It was just the nature of the fire was such, it was too late. Yes, sir.
I believe I read somewhere that the fire marshal, I think it was William Musham, was either demoted or something after all the smoke had cleared. Do you think his demotion, if that was the case, was it deserved or was he made a scapegoat?
I think it was deserved that he didn't run a better department. It's fascinating when after the fire, and everybody started to point fingers at each other. You know, it was your fault. It was your fault. It was the architect's fault. It was the theater owner's fault. It was the inspector's fault and everything. And Musham actually hired a lawyer who wrote an enormous brief. I say enormous, several pages long, proving that it wasn't Musham's responsibility to see that the fire code was enforced. So he said, no, that was that wasn't my doing. And yet, the day of the fire, he, and I mentioned his one of the chiefs under him, Campion. He and Campion were sitting at City Hall where the fire department was housed, and they were congratulating each other. There had been 6,000 fires, more than 6,000 fires in Chicago that year. This was December 30th. In the previous year, it had been 6,000 fires and not a serious one at all. And they were talking like this when all of a sudden the call came over the telegraph that there was a fire at the Iroquois Theatre. Something was wrong. And Musham acknowledged afterwards that he knew it was something serious. So he had a hint that something wasn't right. He must have, for that to have happened. Yes, sir?
Do you think if the fire codes had been followed and the exits marked and everything, would there still have been as great of a loss of life in terms of, because of this huge fireball coming in, I mean, the actual reaction of the actors to open those big doors to get out, was there ever an estimation of how many people were killed by that fireball or blast at first versus like the panicking and the trampling later?
No, what's very interesting is at one point, shortly after the fire, the coroner then put out a list of what was then 570 people. There were a lot of people in hospitals who were dying, who were terminal really. The coroner, the morgue just couldn't handle the crowd of bodies. So the only thing you'll find is that they were all died of suffocation, okay? Even though they may have been burned or trampled. I mean, there were several bodies, including children, who were found without their heads. I mean, it was just terrible what happened. But you ask, would that have happened? Well, are we saying that the fire curtain got stuck anyway?
Yes.
Yeah, but where else would the fumes go? Where else would the fire go? It had to go out in the audience. With those ventilators tied down, there was no place else for it to go. The whole point is to shut off the stage from the auditorium. Most fires in theaters, and someone had done a study, an Englishman had done a study, that there had been something like, I believe, 1,000 fires in the last 50 years in theaters throughout the world, okay? And most fires, just about every fire, starts on stage. You know, there's a candle used in a scene, or something drops from above and creates a mess or something, and boom, it ignites. So you want to protect the stage in a way and make sure that nothing does happen, all right? Yes, sir?
You referred to the ventilators being closed or being tied down or such. Was this, was this negligence on the part of the construction company? Or was it intended to be, were they intended to be tied down?
Oh, gosh, no.
Was it forgotten?
No, there was a lever backstage that you pulled, and it had a sign on it. In case of fire, pull the lever. And the skylights, the ventilators opened up. Now, what's odd about it is there were ventilators also in back of the audience, all right? So when the blast did come through, it headed for the exits that were open, okay? Instead of going up, it went out like that. Yes, sir?
Well, you said there was 2,000 in attendance?
Yes, in the auditorium.
So that there was some success that 1,400 of them managed to get out. How did those 1,400 escape?
People broke down those glass doors in the lobby. Other people just, I'm sorry to say, a number of people just crawled over other people. There were a number, it always shocked people at the time that there were some men who didn't seem to care whether it was a child or a woman, that they were tossing out of their way to get out of the theater. Now, actually, I'm sorry?
Head from a body.
Could you put it down so I can hear you?
How are these heads severed from the bodies that you mentioned?
There were piles of corpses 10 feet high at the bottom of stairwells, people trampling on one another. It just happened. I mean, there were bodies. I said people were going from morgue to try and identify bodies. Some people were just unrecognized. 6 months after the fire, the last person was buried, and it was an unidentified woman. She was unrecognizable. Nobody had ever, well, several people had come forth to claim her body and discovered that it wasn't a friend or a relative and everything. And she was buried in Montrose Cemetery. And at that time, a plaque was put up about the fire, and it exists there. It's a sort of memorial plaque.
Grayson Cemetery?
No, Montrose. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
Majority of the casket out? You said that they had a huge cast?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Did the majority of the cast make it out?
Oh, yes. Backstage, the only ones who died in the fire were only 5 people. One of them was a young lady who would come out at the end of the second act. This was during the second, but routinely came out during the end of the second act on a kind of swing way up high, and she would go over the swing over the audience, scattering flowers. It was, in fact, it was the moment of the show, really. Everybody always talked about it. She was up way up high in the loft, the stage loft, and she was trapped there by the flames and everything, and she was one of the ones who died. But otherwise, everyone else who died were members of the audience. Most of the audience, I think I said, were women and children. 200, more than 200 of those who died were children. Half of those who died, more than half, over 400, were females, either young or old. Housewives numbered about 150 of those who died. I mean, this was a holiday crowd. School teachers, mothers, children. Actually, hardly any men in the theater itself. That was unusual. Can I get any more questions? More than pleased to answer.
McCormick fire, what was the casualty figures on the McCormick place?
I don't know what fire you're referring to, sir.
Burning down McCormick place. It was only in existence for about 5 years, from 61 to 65.
Oh, I don't know.
67.
I'm sorry? Someone said something?
There was a big fire, yes, but I don't think there was much loss of life. I'd have to look it up, but that was...
No.
It was setting up for a show, but it wasn't full of a convention. It could have been much worse. That was January 1967, that fire he's talking about.
Right. Even during your Great Fire here, that destroyed so much of the city, oh, I forget the figure, but it was like 125 people that they know, roughly, that they know died in that fire. I mean, this was an enormous loss. I mean, the city really went into mourning. And it's an interesting thing that, from a historian's viewpoint, the nation, as a nation, the United States, first went into mourning when Abraham Lincoln died. He was assassinated. And his body was taken by train, you know, to Springfield for burial. And it passed through towns and cities and everything and stopped off. And it stopped off here in Chicago. And his body was actually brought into the county courthouse, and people came to express their grief. And that did not happen again, that kind of mass mourning, until the Iroquois Theatre fire. And there were people here in Chicago who had remembered going to see Lincoln's coffin, his casket, who now were going to visit relatives who had died in this fire. We did not have mass mourning again in this country until I think it was 1945, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt died during the Second World War. Then again during the assassination, after the assassination of John Kennedy. And of course, as a result of September 11th in New York City in the World Trade Center. So it's a rare occurrence when you have that kind of mourning among everybody, so to speak. People knew they either had relatives, friends, or they knew someone who died in that fire. It's incredible. Yes, sir.
What source material did you use to find the information for the book?
Well, I worked here at the Chicago Public Library, find out about the fire code and regulations. Worked at the Chicago Historical Society. There, a number of people have left memoirs of what, the survivors obviously, of what happened and their experience in it. Went to newspapers, there've been magazine articles about it, and of course those 2 books I mentioned, which are the same book in a sense. So there's a good deal of material that one can find. And from a journalist standpoint, it's a good story, and that's a terrible way of, calling it. Yes, sir.
I would imagine one of the main factors in the fact that the building was demolished to make way for what is now the Oriental, I would imagine one of the main factors of the building's demise was the fact that it had such, an unsavory reputation. No matter what was in it, the memories remained, and it was probably something that was not desired to keep.
No, as the Colonial Theater, and the Colonial Theater existed from roughly 1904 to 1924 for 20 years. And it was a successful theater, so no, that wasn't a factor. That when it opened 9 months later after the fire as a vaudeville house, then it was in trouble, and people just wouldn't attend it. The day it opened as a vaudeville house, and all signs of the Iroquois were rubbed out. The theater's name, some of the decor and everything, and a big word, vaudeville, down the side of a building, okay? People came out and protested the fact that it was opening. It was terrible.
Was the interior changed? I mean, obviously it had to be rebuilt, but I mean, did it look the same as the Iroquois, or did it?
Oh no, the furnishings, there was no attempt to make it glamorous anymore. None whatsoever. Way back there, lady.
Why do you think this event has been so obscure from a historical basis, unlike the sinking of the Titanic, for example?
Well, let me turn that question back to you folks. When I first started researching the book, came to Chicago, to do it, and I would bump into people, and they'd say, "What are you doing?" I said, Iroquois Theatre fire of 1903, and they said, I never heard about it. And they were Chicagoans. They had been raised in public schools. Now, this time around, when I'm back here, the book is out, some people said, "Oh yeah, I remember there was a mention of it in a civics class, Chicago civics class, about the fire." So let me ask you, how many people had heard about the fire before the last week or two? Oh my. Okay, then you have to explain to me why no one else ever wrote about it. Yes, ma'am.
I'm interested also in the Eastland disaster.
Yeah.
And there's a little society that's been started by some survivors, by the grandchildren of one of the survivors. And their whole idea is to make this known because so many people have never heard of the Eastland disaster. And yet, until 9/11, that was, I guess, the second largest tragedy because 844 people were killed, 1915. And it happened right down here in downtown Chicago by the Clark Street Bridge.
And we had one in New York City, the General Slocum, in the East River that went down with over 1,000 people and things like that. Oh, let me point out that immediately after the Iroquois fire, survivors formed an association, the Iroquois Memorial Association. For one thing, they wanted to take the theater and turn it into some sort of commemorative building, okay? That wasn't, they weren't able to do that. The owners sold the building right out, right away. The association raised a great deal of money, and they built what you would call a clinic or emergency hospital. They took the money on what is now Wacker Drive. And that hospital, well, was around during the Second World War because it was used as a civil defense center. But the Memorial Association sort of died out. They used to hold an annual meeting, an anniversary meeting at the public library, not this one, the old public library, and they even had the fire alarm bell, the first one that had been rung by the firemen, and they would ring it every year on an anniversary day. And the man who rang the fire alarm was the same man who had done it the day of the fire, and who eventually became, over the years, fire commissioner of the city. So there were commemorations held every year in terms of, we should remember this, what happened. But the last survivors sort of died out in the 1960s, and with it, the association. Now, I was going to say something. Let me say something further. In the hospital that was built on Wacker Drive, was this huge plaque on the wall with the names of the people who had died as a result of the fire. 602 names. Above it was a bas-relief sculpture by a very famous Chicago artist named Leratos Taft. Now, whatever happened to the names, we don't know. When the hospital, the building was torn down, the bas-relief sculpture exists. And if you go, as I did the other day, just to check that it was still there, when I went into City Hall on the LaSalle Street side, the entranceway, as you walk in, if you look to the left up on the wall, there is the bas-relief. But there's no indication what it's from. No connection whatsoever with the Iroquois Theatre, but there it is. Now, I was told that there was also a plaque at one time inside the lobby of the Iroquois Theatre, or in the building itself. I went there, nothing exists there. So outside of that Taft bas-relief and the monument that's in Monroe Cemetery, nothing exists. There had been a school with a stained glass window that was put up because a number of students, I think about 12 students and a teacher, had died in the fire. The school was torn down eventually and demolished, and what happened to the stained glass, nobody knows. It really sort of disappeared from history here. Yeah. Anybody else?
We have 3 disasters right in that same, that's a block away from the Eastland disaster.
Yeah.
And there was a 3rd disaster, I believe the date was about 1869, 2 years before the fire, or 1 year before the fire.
I'm not acquainted with
Whereas
that one. I'm sorry.
the hotel burned down at Lake and Wacker, which was the biggest hotel in Chicago at that time, 2 years before the fire. I don't know what the loss of life was there, but it was tremendous, I assume. It was a frame hotel, but very, very large one. And I was trying to get a comparison as to mortality rates and so on, and all these 3 in the same, within a couple of blocks.
I have to confess I don't know about that fire, sir. Yes? Here's a gentleman.
This
was 2 years, about 1869 I'm talking about.
Yes, ma'am.
Were you able at all to track down any relatives of any of the survivors or 2nd or 3rd generation family members and talk to them about what
unfortunately.
what family stories might have been passed down? Or?
Which is why I relied a great deal on the memoirs at the Chicago Historical Society, for example, or the reports in newspapers, interviews with people who had been in the fire. No, I was not able to, unfortunately. Nobody left. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to interject. I do happen to know someone whose father was in it. This woman is 84 years old, so her father was, and again, I just had gotten this story, and I don't have a lot of details, but her father was about 24 years old at the time. And the story goes, as she has told it to me, that he escaped through the woman's restroom.
24 was in the theater that
Yes,
day?
yes.
That's unusual.
Yeah, which is, but he escaped through the women's washroom and supposedly broke a window, and she has a piece of glass that has the chicken mesh, as they did at the time, and that was
Really?
that was a souvenir of the fire.
One of the problems with tracing survivors, not only, there was this list, as I say, of 570 names, but when you have marriages and women get married, they change their last name. So you do get into trouble. I have advertised in newspapers, for example, in the past, and said, does anybody know, or so-and-so related to so-and-so? And that has not worked, at least in my case. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Did you extend your research at all to either of the victims named Hip-Hop, to boys ages 11 and 14 that perished in the fire? Their mother, apparently 9 years later, was still so overcome with grief that she went to Europe for a couple of months and came back on board the Titanic.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Yes, sir.
The McCormick place had only existed for 5 years. I was in attendance about 1962, talking to a fire marshal there, and I said, this building can never burn, it's all fireproof, all cement blocks. He said, yes, but they fill it won't burn, but they fill it full of stuff, and the house where his fire was there. Now the building didn't burn, but they melted the steel braces of the roof, and the whole thing collapsed.
Oh my.
and 5 years later. And I happened to go down there 5 years later when it was all flat, nothing there. And yet, I did a little exploration. Half of the building was still there, intact. Under the Erie Crown Theater, which is the largest theater in the world, except for maybe the RCA in New York, was still intact. Everything was unburned. Just, it was leveled off at the first floor, but the whole basement, half the building was still there, because I explored it all.
You're going to have to excuse me, all right? But it's getting, I know it's getting, yeah. Okay.
Same kind of thing.
Right.
Steel, but collapsed.
Yes, ma'am, quick.
In just the recent things that have happened that we've heard about here, both here and in Rhode Island, just from the standpoint of the research you've done on this fire, do you see any parallels in just like neglect or the fact that the fireproofing still, you know, in our fire here, the most recent one, it was insulation that caught fire. And again, there was no exits. Again, the ushers were untrained. Do you draw
that's
any?
what I said. Those are the parallels.
Do you draw any conclusions, just general, from?
I don't know how you prevent this thing from happening unless you have daily inspections, which are almost impossible. How do you pay for that to have an inspector come by to every restaurant, every theater, every movie house, every place where there's a public assembly and check? In my building where I live in New York City, we have a restaurant on the ground floor. And one day I went down into the basement with the super to take care of something. And there was the restaurant exit through a hallway crowded with tables and chairs. That shouldn't have been, if anything had ever happened. Well, the super reported it to the fire department. But, it's that kind of daily look. See, so it's the responsibility, really, of the owners. And unfortunately, there are some owners who are irresponsible. I want to thank you folks for coming out. It's been a wonderful audience. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
Nat Brand is the former editor of Publishers Weekly. Chicago Death Trap, the Iroquois Theatre Fire of 1903, is published by Southern Illinois University Press. Visit the website on your screen for more information.
Strong hoisted himself up and threw the transom. But once on the other side in a hallway, he found the door secured with a padlock. Just then another man happened to run by. Together the two of them tried to break open the door without success. We worked at the padlock like crazy men, but could make no impression upon it, Strong said, nor could we break the door. The other man boosted Strong up to the transom in the hope that he could pull his family on the other side through it. Strong got the upper portion of his body through and saw his family below. But just at that second, he said, the flames swept through the balcony and smoke poured over the transom. Strong felt himself suffocating, lost his grip, and fell back into the hallway outside. On the other side of the door, his mother, his wife, and his niece lay dead. The convergence of those fleeing the gallery and those exiting the dress circle created an impenetrable tangle. With the theater in darkness, except for the glow cast by the flames in the auditorium, the panic remained unchecked. Covering his mouth with a handkerchief, 70-year-old D.W. Demick made it down from the gallery to the dress circle. He was shocked. People were packed to what had occurred weeks earlier in Cleveland. The sparks ignited a drop curtain, and soon all the nearly 300 scenic drop curtains were in flames. Foy rushed out onto the stage to try and calm the audience. He called for the asbestos fire curtain to be dropped, but he became snagged while not even halfway down. Then a blast of air shot through the auditorium when a door backstage was opened by fleeing actors and stagehands. It swept toward the ceiling of the top balcony, the gallery, a blast of heated, gaseous fumes. To give you an idea of the horrible scenes that followed, I'd like to read a few excerpts from the book. One of the few survivors who was in the gallery, that is the top balcony, was James Strong. Strong was standing with his mother, wife, and niece in the rear of the gallery. They tried to get to the stairway that led down to the dress circle level, but it was too crowded. So they ran down the aisle by the side of the gallery rows and down a short flight of steps to the middle entranceway. But the door there was locked. Strong threw himself against it without success. He then stretched on his toes as far as he could and smashed the glass transom above the door with his fist. The Iroquois Theatre opened in time for the Thanksgiving holiday. To help make up for lost time, performances of Mr. Bluebeard were being held every night and at matinees as well on Wednesdays and Saturdays. Opening night on November 23, 1903, was a festive affair. A glittering tuxedo and ball gown audience, most of Chicago's high society, was there. And another incident occurred. But again, nothing was made of it. The theater's ushers, it turned out, had no idea what to do in an emergency. On Wednesday, December 30th, 2 days before Mr. Bluebeard was to close to make way for another musical, the 2 p.m. matinee performance drew a full house, a holiday crowd, so many that there were 200 standees in the orchestra, dress circle, and top balcony, the gallery. In all, the house held nearly 2,000 persons. On stage, peeking out from behind the curtain, Eddie Foy said he had never seen so many women and children in an audience. Even the gallery was full of mothers and their youngsters. It was during the second act that the disaster happened. Started by a short circuit in a floodlight, an almost similar malfunction.
Carolina Aguilera, thank you.
Thank you very much.
As the investigation continues into the recent nightclub fire in Rhode Island, Book TV takes you back 100 years with Nat Brandt, author of Chicago Death Trap, the Iroquois Theatre fire of 1903. This talk from the Chicago Public Library lasts an hour.
Until the recent terrorist attack on the World Trade Center, the Iroquois Theatre fire of 1903 was the deadliest building fire in American history. The victims, mostly women and children, died in the most dreadful of circumstances, asphyxiated in their seats, trampled upon by a panicking audience, or burned beyond recognition. And it was a tragedy that never should have occurred. Let me set the scene, so to speak. The Iroquois Theatre was a new playhouse, all of 5 weeks old. It was a lavishly decorated theater that wrapped itself around a building at the corner of Randolph and Dearborn Streets, where the Oriental Theater is now. It was, its owners boasted, absolutely fireproof. The Iroquois was built to stage huge musical productions, and its premiere offering was a silly musical comedy entitled Mr. Bluebeard. The cast numbered a staggering 280 performers, but that included about 100 extras, mostly youngsters, who were hired locally to portray animal characters. The show's star was a favorite of Chicago audiences, Eddie Foy. He bustled about the stage in the role of Sister Anne, wiggling an unwieldy bustle, often in a direction directly opposite from the way he was moving. Mr. Bluebeard had opened earlier in New York to mixed reviews. The music, critics there said, was loud, the plot ridiculous, and Eddie Foy, one complained, was only intermittently funny. At any rate, he was not so noisy. But the show managed to run 21 weeks in New York. The company then went on the road, playing Pittsburgh, Indianapolis, and Cleveland, biding time until the completion of the Iroquois. In Cleveland, a curtain caught fire because of an electrical overload, but it was quickly extinguished and no one appeared concerned. Despite a series of labor slowdowns that had delayed its completion,